Hello, welcome to this week's Reflections on the Acts of the Apostles. We're in chapter 22. We've just started chapter 22 actually, so if you want to pause the video and watch or read or listen to whatever you do that chapter, review it if you've already read it. We left off with Paul having just been beaten outside of the temple proper in the court of the Gentiles, arrested by the Roman soldiers, and as he's being taken to the barracks, he asks permission to address the crowd. So here, Paul is addressing the crowd of the Jews who have just beaten him, and we pick up at verse 4 and moving forward from there. And this is, Paul basically is given his pedigree, if you will, in verses 1 through 3, but now he's going to provide a body of proof, so to speak. So he offers 4 scenes from his conversion and the after effects of having been converted to a Christ follower. And they give this evidence, or Paul gives this evidence, and he says it's substantiated by witnesses that his life of Jewish piety and his calling to be able to preach the universal gospel to the Gentiles are compatible, one to another, instead of one or the other. It's a both and situation, not an either or situation, and that's the gist of what he wants to get across to everyone, that he doesn't have to stop being a pious Jew in order to be a Christ follower. So scene 1 then Paul portrays as his persecution of what at that time were called followers of the way. Later we started to call ourselves Christians, or maybe we would be better to call ourselves Christ followers instead of Christians, because Christian, the terminology itself, means little Christs. Not that that's a bad thing, yet Christ follower reminds us that we are to follow his example. We are to live out his example. So the extent of Paul's persecution of the Christ followers, both women and men, maybe children, they're not mentioned, and the outcome, which sometimes was death, but most always flogging, imprisonment, etc., it proved, as far as he was concerned, his intensity or his passion for the Jewish God Yahweh. They were also a silent witness to his sin as he looks backward, to his rebellion against Yahweh God. Indirectly, certainly, unknowingly, perhaps, but Paul never recovers from the shame of being a persecutor of the Christ followers. That had once been for him a badge of honor. Now it's a shame for him. He realizes that the whole time he thought he was serving God, he was actually acting contrary to God. So at this point, Paul simply wants his audience to know his zeal, his passion, and he appeals to the records. Or at the very least, he appeals to the memories of the high priest and the Sanhedrin, probably some of which are in the crowd, who gave him the authority to go and persecute these Christ followers. And they should be able to testify as witnesses, at least to that fact. Scene 2 starts at verse 6. The risen Lord's, Jesus' encounter with Paul on the road to Damascus places Paul under judgment, or at least Paul's life of persecuting believers out of his passion or his zeal for God, as misguided as it was. So Luke highlights the overpowering nature of this divine encounter on the road to Damascus by noting it is a brightness to the day, brighter than the midday sun. This divine light flashed around Paul and his companions on the road, blinding at noontime. So it gives you this sense that you don't look directly into the sun to begin with, but at noontime, this flash of light was so bright that it blinded Paul, cast him to the ground, and there is this theophany, if you will, of this picture of judgment against Paul, in which he finds himself thrown to the ground and blind. So Jesus' haunting question then, and remember, Paul was formerly known as Saul in his Hebrew name. Jesus' haunting question then is in verse 7, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And that reveals to Saul and to us as we read it, and the witnesses to whom he's speaking now, it reveals that Jesus of Nazareth, in his resurrection power, is the key for distinguishing between proper and misguided zeal for God. It is the same in Paul's current day and in our current day, for Jew, for Gentile alike, for Christian, for whomever, whatever denomination of Christian you may consider yourself. Jesus is the litmus test. Any zeal or passion for God that turns a person against those who are followers of Jesus is misguided. Any Christians must also check themselves against doing something that Jesus would not want them to do, that Jesus himself would not do. Remember, Paul had already convinced himself that he was doing God's will until he learned that he was actually violating God's will, which brought shame on himself. And he had a hard lesson to learn in that, and he learned it the hard way. Paul makes sure that this supernatural event, if you will, can serve as a sign and undeniable proof in his speech by describing the experience, and also letting everyone know there were corroborating witnesses to this. He had companions on the road who saw what happened, who are witnesses to what he is telling, and can be witnesses that he is speaking truth. Paul's encounter with Christ was objective, yet it was personal as well. So his companions saw the light surrounding Paul, although they didn't actually see the risen Lord who appeared to Paul. They heard a voice addressing Paul, although they were not actually privy to its message. So the theophany was apparent to everyone, but the message itself was personal to Paul. Paul's enlightenment concerning his guilt and his shame led to the recruitment in Jesus' mission. Here he didn't get his assignment yet. That's in the future shortly. But he got his conversion, and his mission is yet to be determined. Like the crowd at Pentecost, realizing that he was under God's judgment, Paul asks, "What should I do, Lord?" He realizes his guilt and shame, and he turns to God, "What shall I do, Lord?" The Lord did not answer directly. Rather, he calls for Paul to trust, and he calls for Paul's allegiance. And he directed Paul to get up and go into Damascus, go into the city. There you will be told all that you have been assigned to do. That's in verse 10. So Paul receives a commission of sorts. He doesn't know yet the details, but he's received his theophany. He's told, all you're ready to do right now, the next step for you, get up, go into the city, wait for somebody to come and tell you what to do. Whew. How many of us would love that, huh? Well, wait, I have questions. That would be me anyway. Paul's blindness was another sign that something supernatural had indeed happened to him on the road to Damascus. Luke's phrasing that the brilliance of the light, or it may accurately be translated as the glory of the light. Leaves little doubt, at least in our readers' minds, that there is a splendor here. It is of the exalted Lord Jesus appearing from heaven. This is not just a vision. It's not just Paul's imagination or a dream, which could all have taken place as well, just as well. This is a theophany. It's a demonstration of power. So, scene 3. We're moving on now to Damascus itself. We're at verse 12 and following. Scene 3 gives the meaning of Paul's conversion in terms of both divine and human initiative. And here Paul relates his calling to preach a universal gospel, that is, to witness to all people, verses 14 and 15. So Paul testifies before this crowd about Ananias, whose piety, according to the law, was attested to by all the Jews of Damascus. Now, this crowd maybe never heard of Ananias, but they could fact check it, if you will, and send a message to Damascus, and they can verify who Ananias is. His piety, according to the law, attested to by all the Jews of Damascus. So Ananias embodies the continuity and also the discontinuity of a Jewish Christ follower. For the man of such a renowned piety was also the Lord's instrument and mouthpiece for equipping Paul in the first steps of Paul's newfound faith and his mission according to Jesus Christ. So the acted out parable of the Lord's saving work, moving from blindness to sight, was completed as Ananias stood beside Paul. And if you go back to the story itself, you're going to realize Ananias was there reluctantly. He had heard of Paul. He knew why Paul was coming. He didn't really want to go to the house, but he had his assignment from Jesus. So as he stands beside Paul, he says, "Brother Saul, receive your sight." Receive your sight, verse 13. The key role that Ananias plays in Paul's conversion demonstrates to the Jewish crowd that being a pious Jew and being a Christ follower are not at odds with each other, which would have been assumed. You can't be one and be the other, I'm sure the crowd is thinking, but Paul is saying, yeah, I am. Ananias was. You can check our pedigrees, if you will. So as Ananias is interpreted for Paul, his calling on the road to Damascus, this continuity is again emphasized. And he says it was the God of our fathers who had appointed him. Very Jewish. God had chosen Paul to know his will, that is, Yahweh's will. From the Damascus road encounter, Paul had the haunting realization that his persecution had been directed at Jesus of Nazareth, not just Christ's followers, but at Jesus himself, the risen and exalted Messiah of Yahweh. So from this experience with Ananias, Paul knew that God's will must have something to do with his saving purposes and their accomplishment through the gathering body of believers called, at that time, followers of the way. Still, God had chosen Paul for more. Paul was privileged, like the other apostles, though Paul himself says he was one abnormally born, to see the risen Lord. Okay? This was not a vision again. It wasn't a dream. This was a theophany. The risen Lord appeared to Paul on the road to Damascus. So Paul considers himself an apostle, calls himself one abnormally born. He wasn't an apostle in the same terms as the 12. So Ananias used the messianic title, the Righteous One, to refer to Jesus himself. This points to the heart of the gospel. The risen, exalted Jesus of Nazareth, whom Paul sees, literally, on the road to Damascus, is now the justified victim of an innocent death. And Paul was destined to hear from that voice right from the mouth of Jesus himself. Hear the gospel message, to which Paul was called to become a lifelong witness. And he was literally spent the rest of his life witnessing and planting churches around the Gentile world. So this revelation of the gospel would both fulfill and supersede the Jewish document of promise, that is, what they call the law, or we might call the law. Remember that Jesus said that he did not come to abolish the law or the prophets. He said he came to fulfill them. You can see that in Matthew 5:17. So Paul's responsibility, his apostolic calling, if you will, was to be Christ's witness to all people of what he had seen and heard on the road to Damascus. Though the universal scope of the gospel offer of salvation, then, is stated in general terms here. In the end, it will prove to be the stumbling block to those who hear his speech, verses 21 and 22 in current text of this text we're studying right now. But note how much of the gospel message is either stated or implied in Ananias's short speech to Paul. Ananias rightly concluded that Paul's gospel was revealed to him from heaven. It wasn't just something he heard along the way. He didn't hear it from Peter or one of the other apostles. He heard the gospel straight from Jesus Christ on the road to Damascus. So either as a mild rebuke, as the New International Version might have it, or possibly even as a simple question, like, what are you waiting for? Ananias completed his mission by encouraging Paul that in the next steps, he will be fulfilling his responsibility in response to his conversion. He was to get up, be baptized, wash away your sin. So you might consider, even as Paul is telling his conversion experience in stages, he received it in stages as well. He received the conversion experience on the road to Damascus. What shall I do, Lord? Well, for right now, you get up and get into the city and wait. Okay. And now he's waited. Ananias is there, restored his sight. What do I do now, Ananias? What do I do, Lord? Get up, get baptized, wash away your sin. He's getting this in stages. So sometimes we need to understand that. We may not have the whole thing all presented to us all at once like we want it. You know, I got questions. Okay, wait. So picturing that outward purification of baptism, washing away your sins, there's also an inward cleansing from his sin that has resulted in his calling on the name of the Lord for salvation. So proof number 4, we're at 17 through 21 now. This is the last scene in which Paul himself models the tension of continuity and discontinuity in a Jewish Christ follower's life. He remained loyal to the Lord's holy place, exercising piety in worship in the temple upon his return to Jerusalem, just as he had been called upon to do by the Jerusalem Council, referred back to the last chapter. And even after this conversion, then, he still practiced a piety that exposed the lie that was being told about him that brought these recent charges that Paul had turned against the temple. He never did. That he disdainfully defiled the temple by bringing Gentiles into the sacred areas. He never did. Those were just lies told about him to make him appear guilty of something that never happened. After Paul's return from Damascus to Jerusalem during worship in a trance, Paul saw Jesus, the Lord of the temple, verses 17 and 18. The Lord directed Paul to leave Jerusalem immediately because they will not accept your testimony about me. Now, this was a vision that he received earlier in a trip to Jerusalem, not at this time. He's telling a story about what happened in this final scene of his conversion experience. So this heavenly command to leave this time, that time, his rationale declared a kind of a scandalous proposition. If you think about it, the Jewish temple, the Jewish leaders, the religious leaders had rejected Jesus as Messiah, crucified him, which was the sign of being cursed by God. Now Paul is saying, well, the last time I was here, I was in the temple, and the risen Lord Jesus appeared to me in the temple. Everybody would have been aghast at that statement. It would have been like, ah! And this idea, that's scandalous. That the risen, exalted Messiah would direct his messenger of salvation tidings away from Israel? That this Messiah that was rejected by Israel would appear in the temple to instruct Paul, whom now they want to kill him already. So here again, this rationale is an indictment of Israel in general's unwillingness to receive the gospel message. Their zeal or their passion for the nation of Israel blinded them to God's will and Jesus' gospel message. This is not, a new thing. This has been what the Gospels have been explaining to us all along. So Paul shows his passion for the people of Jerusalem by beginning to argue with the Lord in that vision from a previous trip to Jerusalem. So read through this section again, verses 19 and 20. Paul says, I argued with him. I'm in the temple worshiping as I'm called to do as a good Jew, and he's arguing with the exalted Messiah. Have you ever had an argument with Jesus? Good luck with that. Paul's reasoning was that his life as a persecutor and his service as an accomplice to Stephen, the martyr's death, he was the one guarding over the cloaks, giving permission for them to stone Stephen to death, would be enough evidence of his Jewish loyalty and would gain him a hearing in retelling of this story. Well, Paul's arguing with Jesus on this previous vision that he's talking about, yet the Lord did not argue with Paul. That's why I say good luck with that. You can argue with Jesus all you want. He's not going to argue back. The Lord had already given his rationale to Paul. Israel did not oppose the messenger. They opposed the message. Jesus said, your testimony about me, in verse 18. All that remained was for the Lord to repeat the command for Paul to obey. Go. Paul starts arguing with the Lord. The Lord doesn't argue back. He says, go. I will send you far away to the Gentiles. Verse 21. So the Gentile mission was the focus of Paul's ministry. Yet always within Paul's agenda was to go first to the Jewish synagogues. Wherever he went, if there was a Jewish synagogue, that's his first stop. And that's also where he proclaimed the good news of Jesus Christ, the risen and exalted Messiah, to the Jews. That was his strategy. So remember that. Paul always went to the synagogue first when he entered a new city, if there was a synagogue. In the divinely commanded mission to the Gentiles and the Jewish people's refusal to accept the gospel, not all of them, of course, some of them did, we have the explanation of the Jewish opposition to Paul. So those who rejected Jesus' gospel and message, of course they're going to reject Paul as well. Even though the charges are false, the opposition is real. The rejection is not about Paul. The rejection is about the proclamation of Jesus as Messiah. So that takes us through a larger section. I know we're smack dab in the middle of chapter 22, but now we're starting a whole new section, conversation. This starts kind of the Roman experience for Paul. Starting at chapter 22, verse 22, through 23:11, we're going to talk more about Paul within the Roman setting. So, as we have seen throughout Paul's 3 missionary journeys, checking my time here, excuse me. As we have seen throughout Paul's 3 missionary journeys, when people react to the gospel preaching, they are either glad or they're mad. Luke wants Theophilus, to whom he is writing, his contemporaries, who will probably be reading this with him, or they're having it read to them, and us, as we look back and study this, to see this again as he presents the various reaction to Paul and his witness here and in other places. In the process, we will learn 2 aspects of Paul's gospel that motivate Jewish opposition. One is the offer of the salvation to the Gentiles on the same basis as the Jews, and the resurrection of the body, which was rejected by the Sadducees, but not necessarily by the Pharisees. So even within Jewish society, there was complications about resurrection. So the idea that a supposed heavenly vision in the temple would send Paul to the Gentiles was unthinkable. The Jews would not accept that. It was a blasphemous notion. So the crowd reacted as this red flag, waving the red flag before the bull kind of thing. Vocally, even violently, raising their voices. They want to drown Paul out so nobody can hear what they don't want to hear. Imagine them covering their ears and yelling and hollering. They took up again the cry to rid the earth of this man. He's not fit to live, verse 22. So their reasoning was that the proclaimer of such an apostasy, which means to turn away from the faith, who was turned away from the Jewish faith, is not fit to live. Screaming excitedly, throwing off, or better, shaking out their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, signifying something is offensive to God. The crowd shows that they want to have nothing to do with Paul. To them, he is a repulsive individual. He is like the Gentiles. He's unclean. The earth would be better off without him. So these Jews in this crowd show themselves to be unfit evaluators of Christianity because they've turned their backs on the Messiah. Their national pride and their prejudice are a warning to everyone, everywhere. We have our own red flags that cause the same kind of paralysis of our mind and our hearing, whether we presume an attack on our national pride or on our religious traditions or whatever it is. The presumed attacks can be put into an immediate stop to our reasoning, to our logic. It substitutes kind of a blind, angry spirit within us, a granite-like resistance to whatever is going on. We don't even want to hear it. The hand, talk to the hand, as they saying used to go. And I've seen such reactions sometimes after a Sunday sermon. I remember one Father's Day. We're a little bit past Father's Day now, of course, but I remember one Father's Day in one of my previous churches. I gave a sermon based on an article I had read in a Christian magazine that talked about the habits of a highly effective father. And I thought that was a great thing. I could learn from it. And I thought, it uses biblical examples to support each of those habits. I feel good about this message. I want to share this with other fathers. And one woman came storming out of church that day. She ripped me up and down, telling me she had a good father and I had no right to put him down the way I did. And I was stunned. I'm like, I don't have any idea what you're talking about. I wasn't putting anyone down. When I read the article, I took it as a learning lesson, but apparently she took it as a put down of her own father. That's how sometimes we can be blinded by our own traditions, our own thoughts, our own pride, if you will. I don't know what best way to describe it to you. Maybe you can hear it in the right way as I'm trying to relay it. But that was just one personal experience that just threw me for a loop. It still does. I still have the memory of that, obviously. So that's where I want to stop. I'm out of time. We got up to chapter 22, verse 24. So next time we'll move on from there, talking about some governmental curiosity on the part of the Romans. Thanks for joining me again today. I hope you're having a great week. If you're in the Sun City Center area, please feel free to join us on Sunday morning at 10 a.m. If not, you can join us via our live stream also at 10 a.m. Take care. God bless.